Let's take a look at exercise 5 from section 6.3. We want to factor this trinomial. One way to factor this is to use the AC method. That's where we multiply the coefficient A. Remember, we're thinking of our trinomial as ax squared plus bx plus c. So A is the number being multiplied by x squared, and C is the constant in the problem. B is the number being multiplied by x, which in this case is negative 38. A times C is 15 times 11, which is 165. So we're trying to find two integers that multiply to give A times C, which also add to give negative 38. All right, now 165 is a large number for what we're doing, and one of the things that I have to keep in mind is that when I'm trying to find factors, I can always start with the two factors that I begin with. So if these two numbers are going to multiply to be positive and add to give a negative, they have to have the same sign. So a positive times a positive is positive, but that won't add to a negative. A negative times a negative is positive and will also add to a negative. So the two numbers that I'm looking for are both going to be negative. So I can start with 15 and 11 as my two factors. So remember, the product needs to be 165 and the sum needs to be negative 38. Now obviously these two numbers, 15, so in other words, since both of them need to be negative, I would be using negative 11 and negative 15. Obviously those don't add to negative 38. When I add these together, I get negative 26. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use factors, numbers that do divide into these two numbers, and see what happens if I divide one of those numbers into 165. So 3 divides into 15. So I'm going to use a negative 3, and what I'm interested in is not how many times negative 3 goes into 15, but how many times does negative 3 go into 165. So if I divide 165 by negative 3, I get negative 55. And so right off the bat, I get another pair of numbers just by using the two numbers that I already had, that I started with. And so obviously that does not give me what I need. Notice that negative 3 plus negative 55 adds up to negative 58. But we also realize that 5 divides into 15. So let's take, we know that both our numbers need to be negative, so we're going to take a negative 5, and we're going to see how many times does that divide into 165. And you'll notice that negative 5 divides into 165 a negative 33 times. And so I found other factors of 165 by using factors that I know go into these two factors. Any factor of 15 has factors that are also factors of 165. And notice these are my two numbers. They multiply to give 165 and they add to give negative 38. So my two numbers are negative 33 and negative 5. It doesn't matter what order we use those in. So once I find those two numbers, I'm going to take this trinomial, and I'm not going to change the first term, but instead of writing the middle term as negative 38x, I'm going to write it as negative 5x minus 33x. And then I'm not going to change the last term. And I'm going to factor by grouping. These first two terms are my first group, and the GCF, greatest common factor, of these two terms is 5x. So 5x times 3x gives me 15x squared, and 5x times minus 1 gives me a minus 5x. So since I was able to find these two numbers that multiplied to give AC and added to give B, then I know, as long as I'm not making any errors, that there's a GCF of the last two terms that also multiplies by 3x minus 1. And actually, I'm going to use colors here. And let's see what that GCF is. 3x multiplies by a negative 11 to give negative 33x, the third term. And negative 11 times negative 1 does multiply to give me plus 11, the fourth term. So my factorization is 3x minus 1. That's the common factor. I'm using the distributive property in reverse. In first position, 3x minus 1 was multiplied by 5x, and in second position, it was multiplied by negative 11. And this then is my final answer.